Namaste and good evening everyone to people joining us from India and good morning to people joining us from USA. On behalf of IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi. I, Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, welcome you to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today we are here for a panel discussion on learning by comparing global protest, Black Lives Matter, Anti-CAA and farm protest. I would now like to invite Dr. Arjun Kumar, who is Director at IMPRI, to take the deliberation forward. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Ritika. And I welcome all of you for this very pertinent discussion, which Ajay sir has been leading. This is the third in the series. And really, from the last 2-3 months, we have been witnessing the global protests worldwide on so many different issues. So we have experts today to deliberate on this very important deliberation, the panel discussion on learning by comparing global protest politics, BLM, Anti-CAA, farm protest, and many other protests also. So we are so glad to have our chair and moderator for the day, for this event, Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy, who is Associate Professor at Center for Political Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi. We also have joining from USA, Professor Jeffrey C. Alexander, who is Lillian Chavenson Yaden Professor of Sociology at Yale University, USA. Thank you, sir, and welcome. We also have Dr. Hilal Ahmed, sir, who is Associate Professor at Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS at New Delhi. So I welcome you all. And we also have from Scotland, Dr. Trevor Stack also joining. Welcome, Trevor sir also. So over to Ajay sir to take the proceedings further.
Okay, thanks Arjun for this. Arjun is the man behind the show. I'm only assisting Arjun in organizing a series of events. Last month, Jeff, we did with Trevor and another friend working at Nick, who's in the Fordham University in New York. And this week we thought we will do on something that India has been witnessing. I'm sure all of you have been following on net, an extensive kind of unprecedented protest by farmers, which is now, some scholars say, is one of the largest protests anywhere in the world. And certainly the largest protest after the post-independence period in India. This winter we had, and the protest is still an ongoing protest. Last winter, exactly at this time of the year, we had another similar kind of a protest, which was called the Anti-CAA protest against the Citizenship Amendment Act that the current regime was trying to push, which there are a lot of confusions about the provisions of it, but by and large, it was an act that made the citizenship of many Muslims vulnerable in the Indian context. Therefore, a lot of Muslim women came onto streets in Delhi and elsewhere in different places in India to protest. My own understanding has been, and Hilal is here who follows it closely, anti-CAA movement, that a farmers movement got a kind of traction, if one way to compare with the anti-CAA movement, much wider traction in compared to the anti-CAA movement. And this is where I must put it on record that last year or so, much of my writings, Hilal, I owe to Professor Jeffrey Alexander. I was feeling lost with this rise of the current regime, massive confusion, hard materialist analysis, and political economy was simply not explaining this trend of popularity of Mr. Modi in spite of economic downslide and so many symbolic gestures that this regime made. So, Jeff, I owe it to you. As I said, he is my friend, philosopher, and guide who helped me reading cultural sociology, reading especially his book on power and performance, really helped me make sense of how symbolic representation, myths and meanings, how they play a constant role in modern politics. It is from that angle, actually, Jeff, the very question that I posed in a couple of my recent articles that I keep sharing with Jeff, and I know I should also put it on record that he indulges me a lot, that I keep troubling him with a lot of my elementary doubts, questions, and Jeff never fails responding and clarifying how cultural sociology is actually working on ground. And actually, one can frame questions in a very concrete sense by using the cultural sociology frame. That's where the question that we are really trying to understand today is that looking at both these protest movements, what explains the difference in the political regime's response to farmers' movement, which is also led by a certain region, which is essentially led by Sikhs who are non-Hindus and Jats who belong to a specific caste. But they lay a stake for certain kind of a universal normativity by arguing that they are the food providers. It is about the food security of India. It is about the corporate development. That's what we refer to as the universal normative claims. But Jeff, even anti-CAA movement made similar claims. It was not, though it was essentially over a period of time, it became a movement led by essentially led and perhaps participated by Muslim and Muslim women and a certain small section of left liberal students, maybe social activists. Even the anti-CAA movement did not talk only about Muslim citizenship. They did talk about the slogan of saving democracy. They did talk about saving constitution. They did invoke the symbolism of Gandhi and Ambedkar, which are like a part of a universal collective conscience of India. But in spite of that, what could perhaps explain that the anti-CAA movement is something that, as I understand, I mean, some scholars do think it has been a big movement. It is perhaps the one which challenged the regime. But in my own understanding, the current political regime is happy to have the anti-CAA movement as a kind of a Muslim protest in different blocks, and it helps them consolidate and polarize Hindu majority. When it came to the farmers' movement, the current political regime tried something very similar. They refer to them as terrorists, as Khalistanis, as rich farmers. So the kind of things that we often discuss, Jeff, in your own work, the kind of cultural codes, symbolic representation from both ends. There was this tussle going on. But in the second farmers' case, the current political regime did not succeed. None of this got traction in terms of Khalistanis, in terms of they being terrorists, in terms of they having a polarized agenda. They even talked about a global conspiracy. Even recently, they arrested a 22-year-old girl. They linked it up to farmers' protests. They did all kinds of theatrics, but that performativity did not work. And this is my question for both of you today evening, that what possibly explains. Romila Thapar, an ancient historian, Hilal would know, perhaps Jeff, you would have also heard of Romila's work. In a recent book on dissent, she in fact argues that India has always, as a civilization, has always had dissent. And it's a dissent that she goes into details of the nature of dissent. But she makes a very interesting point that resonates with your work, where she argues that Gandhi's strategies of mobilization spoke to the what she refers to as the collective subconscious of India. Therefore, satyagraha as a non-violence and civil disobedience as a method of mobilization immediately resonate with majority groups. And therefore, this idea of collective subconscious. And you use the question, when I asked a similar question to you over our exchanges about the Muslim question, you made a passing remark that Muslims in India are struggling to enter the national consciousness, which you compared with the question of civil rights, black movement in the United States, with Martin Luther King, the way he mobilized the movement in the South, how it got traction with the whites in the North, what kind of cultural code, symbolic representation that he kind of interpreted to get this kind of a mainstreaming. And today we can see that the kind of traction that Black Lives Matter got in United States, I mean, in a sense, it's literally changed the government from Republican to the Democrat. Hilal, in his own work, I mean, Jeff, Hilal does very interesting work on the Muslim question, even otherwise in terms of political theory. I remember, Hilal, I read your recent piece of Gandhi on Muslims, which you make very, very interesting, where Gandhi made an appeal, you write, to Muslims in Pakistan to take responsibility for Muslims in India. This usually does not go well with the secular framing. We often combine national identity, territoriality, but Gandhi, I think, was an interesting, in terms of this, one could refer to this as a populist, universal normative frame, the way Gandhi built in Indian context. Do you think that will give us some interesting clues in terms of how we can reframe? Because I certainly feel, I mean, theory is one thing, but I think there's a impending need to reframe the Muslim question with a sense of an urgency, because the kind of marginalization, nature of violence that is growing post-Delhi riots. Recently, you must have seen yesterday, Caravan came out with a report on the Delhi nature of Delhi violence that happened. One is pain to say that there is no popular response to the violence against Muslims. And this is where I think Jeff's work becomes, Jeff, I should confess, I reread your response to Axel Honneth this morning again. And you make this point about Honneth's argument that mere compassion and emotions do not naturally translate, that moral compunction does not necessarily translate into solidarity. And you argue that it is mediations that matter, symbolic representations that matter to translate those underlying cultural codes, underlying symbolism, underlying emotions into, so that these movements can, the idea is that so that these movements can reoccupy the cultural codes in a way where they are part of a larger solidarity. I think to a large extent, farmers' movements seem to have succeeded in getting those cultural codes right, in getting a kind of attraction, in putting a kind of a moral authority, putting a moral pressure on the current regime that they could not use force. Their kind of dirty tricks did not work. But that is not the case with the Muslims. And therefore, I think the current regime gets away every time by generating fictitious accounts of Muslims being enemies. Yesterday, Jeff, I shared this report of the Caravan magazine that they did with the Delhi riots, where a young man who took part in the Delhi riots considers Muslims to be increasing like enemies, a growing threat on Hindus. So therefore, I think there is something in the collective subconscious that we need to seem to frame the Muslim question very, very differently from the way it has been framed by both the opposition parties, secular scholarship in India, and what that could be, I think, is a question that will really interest me, that one could go into in today's evening's discussion. And I'm happy to share Professor Harbans Mukhia, a leading historian, is with us. Thanks, sir, for joining us. We would request you to intervene once Jeff and Hilal have presented on this very important question, because you have written extensively on medieval history. So we are trying to grapple with the current question of comparing Black Lives Matter. So what can we learn by comparing Black Lives Matter with anti-CAA protests and farmers' protests? So now I take great pleasure in inviting Professor Jeffrey Alexander to make his presentation, and then we will request Hilal to come second, and then we will take it over.
Thank you, Ajay. I'm really delighted to be here and to be talking to audiences in India. And I'm really interested in the social movements in India that we're talking about today. I'm looking forward to learning a lot. I mean, just a little bit of background theoretically before talking about Black Lives Matter. I think every democratic society has contradictions at its historical origins, each expressed differently. So there's a commitment to a universalistic and egalitarian society with mass participation and civil solidarity that can be written into the Constitution, into the Bill of Rights, et cetera. And then there's the particularistic and primordial qualities of the core group that establishes that civil society in a time and a place. And those are, for example, religious commitments of the core group, racial identities, gender, of course, region, ethnicity, sexuality, language, and class, if you want to think of class in that way. And the way I see it is that these contradictions that are built into the DNA of a democratic society create strains that are endemic, and that these strains trigger the protest movements against injustice because many groups are, in fact, if not in theory, left out, excluded from the core groups that define the actual solidarity, the dominant solidarity in that democratic society. And if the institutions of communication, like journalism and mass media, and if the institutions of regulation, for example, the law and the court system and the system of voting, if they maintain enough independence or autonomy from the core group and the state that's often controlled by the core groups, then these protest movements are allowed to a significant degree to play themselves out, if you want to put it that way, to play themselves out before the court of public opinion. How does this work? Protest movements, as Ajay mentioned, I see them as social performances, not in an insincere sense of hypocrisy, but as true performances that they create and project symbolic representations of their own suffering, of their own experience of injustice, and intertwine them with the universalizing promises of the originating civil sphere wrapped up inside of the nation, language of the nation. So, America promised us this, our rights as citizens, the Indian Constitution. And they project these symbolic representations, their narratives, and codes to audiences of what you might call citizen audiences, who are first their own potential followers so that they can create a mass movement, but then members, the elite and mass members of the core groups. And these protests are projected and interpreted via mass media and hedged in to one degree or another by the law and by the police. If these performances are successful, they can gain a certain amount of civil identification so that the citizens, audiences outside of the protest groups and the groups who they're speaking on behalf of can imagine themselves inside of the life situations of the protesters, and they might empathize with their suffering, and then they can engage in structural reforms via control of the state or the states. Now I want to talk about Black Lives Matter. Race is the most primary originating contradiction in the creation of American democracy, much more significant than class and religion. And that's, of course, a point of comparison, a point of vast contrast with India. America was started as an incredibly innovative democracy on the one hand. It was also started as a white system of white supremacy, in which in the southern half of the United States, which was very much part of the core group, there was slavery. And since America's constitutional founding in 1789, there's been 3 waves of protest movements against white supremacy, each of which has gained significant civil identification and been able to create very significant structural reform. The first protest movement was called abolitionism, the movement to abolish slavery that occurred between 1820 and 1865. Abolitionists were not free of racism themselves, but they felt tremendous indignity against the institution of Black enslavement. They were almost entirely whites, although some freed Black people played significant roles, like a man named Frederick Douglass. Abolitionism was a very successful symbolic movement in white society in the North. It gained tremendous amount of group identification through movies, they didn't have movies, through novels, through newspaper articles, through lectures. In fact, many people believe, and I'm among them, that the Civil War that occurred between the North and the South between 1860 and 1865 was a war triggered by the success of the abolitionist movement against slavery, and in fact, the war abolished slavery. It didn't abolish racism, but it abolished slavery. The second massive protest movement against racial domination was what we call the civil rights movement, which was Black-led, not white-led, between 1956 and 1968, which revolved, it was a mass movement of working class African Americans, but it was led and organized and represented by Martin Luther King. King was, my argument about the Black civil rights movement is that it succeeded because it gained the identification of white citizens in the North. It was a movement powered by Blacks, but its audience was not Southern. It played out in the South, but its audience were Northern whites mostly. King succeeded in becoming what many people say is a person who is regarded as the most important person, American of the 20th century. He's the only 20th century American for whom there's a national holiday at his birth. He was loved by many white people and became a genuine martyr. Why did he succeed in this, aside from his own personal qualities? One is nonviolence, the influence of Gandhi. And before that, Gandhi was influenced, by the way, by somebody named Thoreau, who invented the idea of civil disobedience when an American in the 1830s, 40s, who refused to pay war taxes here. But King was inspired by Gandhi. Nonviolence is basic because it is a fundamental civil performance, a refusal to engage in aggression. Of course, nonviolence can be very aggressive or very militant, as Gandhi knew and as King knew. The other thing is that King emphasized freedom and equality, which I call the discourse of civil society. He kept quoting the discourse of the founders. And third and finally, he was Christian. African Americans are this is a vast generalization, but they are very religious, and they embraced Christianity under slavery when they were enslaved. And Black religiosity is very important. So many Americans who were white could identify with the Black protest movement because they invoked Christianity, the suffering of Jesus Christ, the obligations of the Ten Commandments, etc. There were significant changes after the civil rights movement. There was the abolition of the apartheid system in the South, increase of voting laws, the creation of a new Black middle class. Yet at the same time, there was tremendous backlash movements. That's one of the main reasons for American conservatism, from Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan to George Bush, is racial reaction against the success of the civil rights movement. There was also, because of the civil rights movement, paradoxically, the creation of a Black underclass in the inner cities of the United States, as Black people who were well employed in the working class and had trade unions and were middle class and higher, moved out of the inner cities. The third great movement, which is still unfolding, is the Black Lives Matter movement, which has had two phases. The first was 2012 to 2015. The second, and then the reaction against it, the backlash, elected Trump. And then towards the end of Trump's presidency, in the summer of 2020, there emerged a new massive phase of Black Lives Matter, which produced some backlash, but was more successful in capturing identification and helped to elect Biden. And just a few words about that. These movements are, Black Lives Matter is organized within the Black community, led by upper middle class, highly educated African-American women. I mean, they're the leaders of it. It has a sophisticated technology via social media. But in terms of its symbolic performances, it's about martyrdom of Black people who are murdered by police. Both of these movements were triggered, and the symbolism that permeates them is around the trauma of young Black men in the underclass who have been brutally murdered by white policemen. So for the first phase of Black Lives Matter, the murder of Trayvon Martin and Eric Gardner generated symbols. For example, Eric Gardner said, "I can't," produced by millions of protesters throughout the United States. Trayvon Martin wore a hoodie, and then there was the Million Hoodies for Justice March in response to that, in which many young white people took part. And then in 2020, there was the murder of George Floyd, when a Minneapolis policeman put his knee on his neck and suffocated him to death. And that George Floyd has become a symbolic martyr of this protest movement as well. In both these cases with Black Lives Matter, the main newspapers in terms of journalism and television have been sympathetic. And there's been a massive identification. At the same time, there's a lot of specific elements that are involved, but at this point, the new Democratic administration has made the fight against systemic racism and white supremacy a public core to its political platform. I mean, we'll see, of course, what happens. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great. I mean, it's a kind of a continuity of what we have been discussing. So I'll come back with few specific questions for you to extend it to the Indian context. You might have a few reflections on how it's playing out in India. I mean, you are following, I know, what is happening in Indian context. So, but I think you'll get a much closer picture with after Hilal's presentation. Hilal would perhaps be going into details of this comparison. So over to you, Hilal. Looking
Yeah.
forward to listening to you.
First of all, thank you, Ajay, and thanks IMPRI for giving me this opportunity to share some of things which I have been doing. And your title is so provocative and creative that this actually gave me some kind of a framework to respond to the question which you just posed, as well as the idea when you discussed that with me. So, and I'm also grateful and honored to be here with Professor Jeffrey Alexander and with Professor Harbans Mukhia. We all know both of you, and great to have you with us here today, and Trevor, of course. What I am actually going to do is to think carefully about, I start with, as I said, with the title, Comparison for Learning. Now, we can compare movements in a number of different ways. We can say that there are some similarities and differences of context. We can also say that there are certain strategies which Jeff very rightly pointed, performances, differences and similarities in performances. We can also compare with regard to the mode of collective political action, etc. But when we add the idea of learning with it, the things change. And what do then the comparison would actually lead us to a direction in which we can do at least two things. One is we can ask a few new questions. For example, what to learn, and how to whatsoever we learn, how to link with our thinking. And finally, and that's the most important question for me at least, is that comparison of this kind can lead us to, and I borrow this term from one of my colleagues, Aditya Nigam. He uses this quite creatively, and the phrase is thinking about unthinkable. Because these are the protest movement, and these protest movement can also direct us to think of the larger question of our existence, larger question of the relationship between the social and the political. So with these preliminary remarks, I think it would be sensible for me to go into some of the features which I identified of the two movements which we experienced and witnessed in India. One is anti-CAA protest, and then the recent farmer protest. But before I go into that, I would like to make a few clarifications. The first clarification is something which I have been saying for some time, that my understanding of Black Lives Matter is rather sketchy. So I rely entirely on what Jeff just presented, and then I'll make a few broad observations. Second is that this idea of thinking about unthinkable is not to suggest that we should go and think about utopia. Rather, we should actually carefully look at, ask some broad abstract question of existential type. And these are important questions for me at least. And finally, that I'm also a bit critical of the movement, because there is a tendency to glamorize the protest and movement. So I think and I know that and I'm sure that on Facebook, many of our activist friends must be watching and must be participating in these discussions. But I think that the purpose is not to criticize them, rather to think critically about the questions which are coming to us. So if that is the case, then let me just quickly look at the nature of these two movements. What was the basic fundamental questions these two movements were raising? Basically, both the movement, anti-CAA protest as well as farmers protest, were protective in nature, meaning these movements were not challenging anything. Rather, the focus was entirely on to protect something which actually exists. So this structural existentialism is something which is very crucial to recognize, because they were not actually coming out as a challenger of something, that this is in a classical Marxist framework when we say that society is class divided and we are here to actually overthrow the class system, etc. These are very carefully thought of movement or protest, where they are saying that there is something which is good in this structure. There are some good structures, and we must protect these structures, and we must defend. So the idea of radicalism of defense, not challenge, is something which is the key for both the movement. And because they were the defenders, that's the reason why three interesting features that emerge in both the movements, anti-CAA as well as the recent farm protest. One is that the emphasis on non-party. Both the movements, anti-CAA protest as well as the farmer protest, emphasize the fact that we are non-party movement. In that sense, I think they were rejecting the competitive electoral politics in a significant way. So detaching from the formal institution of what we understand as politics, electoral politics, and asserting a different realm of the political is something which is very remarkable and innovative. So I think we must also, and this is a classical distinction between politics and political. And I again, say that two of my colleagues are actually working on these ideas, Prathama Banerjee and Aditya Nigam. And I'm interested into that the formal sphere of politics where institutions are located somehow questioned, and these protest movement disassociate themselves with the party things. Why they were doing so, I'll come back to this later on Q&A, because there's a lot of debate and lot of discussion, especially what really happened in Rajya Sabha. Remember in Rajya Sabha when CAA passed, NDA did not have a majority. They had only 99, BJP had only 99 members, and the total NDA strength was 104, and they required 121 votes to get this thing passed. And how many votes they got? 125. It says that the parties which were criticizing the CAA outside, they played a very dubious role inside the parliament. So therefore, getting rid of Congress versus BJP, etc., these movement, at least CAA, were very categorically disassociate from the mainstream political parties, and this is something which we are also find in farmers movement, that we are not interested in any political party come on the center stage. So that's the first thing, performative aspect, where you have to assert non-party political formation or the character. The second thing, the new symbolism, and is a fascinating discussion by Jeff. The performative aspect of these, that idea of flag, idea of constitution, Ambedkar, the photo of Ambedkar, photo of Gandhi. These were new symbolism. Remember, all these national symbols were somehow somehow used by the hegemonic powers, especially the state. Now, since 2010, and I would say especially after anti-corruption movement in 2011, 2012, the idea of flag, idea of constitution, idea of the figure of Gandhi and Ambedkar reinvented in a significant way, and that provide new kind of symbolism. And the third characteristic which combine both of these, both anti-CAA and the farmer protest, is the idea of representation. Look at, and Ajay, I completely agree with you that mainly the Muslims were the participant, but the idea was that it should not look like as if that's a Muslim-led thing. And that's the reason why, very interestingly, the conventional Muslim political leadership was sidelined. Especially in Shaheen Bagh. Shaheen Bagh was an interesting case where someone like Chandrasekhar would become a Muslim leader. And he was there on the street of Jama Masjid. So the symbolism, again, he was holding the copy of the constitution, and he was on the stairs of Jama Masjid. It says something. A Dalit leader who has got the copy of Ambedkar's constitution, and he is there at a mosque which is considered to be the political center of Muslim, etc. So that symbolism is something which makes the performative aspect quite unusual and creative. And finally, and you can also, we have seen that what really happened when Sanयुkt Kisan Morcha actually criticized the events that took place on Red Fort. So it means that the conventional leadership, which reduced everything to Muslim and Sikh in both the movement, were, they get rid of that, and they decided that the idea of representation should be revisited and re-articulated. So this is what I really like when you say comparison. But what was the response? I would say that the response was quite identical, and it had actually 4 stages. I would say this is a 4-ladder response by the state. At the bottom level, we had pro-CAA protest and pro-farmers law protest. Meaning, at the bottom level of society, there are protests for protecting the status quo, protest against protest. At the bottom level. At the middle level, the second level, there are media, the pro-government media, which would legitimize these pro-laws protest as the honest, rational protest movement, and discredit the anti-CAA protest and the farmer protest. The third level is the middle level BJP leadership, which would provide some kind of a justification to the media-driven discourse. And finally, at the top level, there is a strange silence. So Mr. Modi won't say anything until and unless, look at in CAA, when things were, in absolute, because that was actually an electoral thing. There was an election rally in Delhi, where for the first time, Mr. Modi spoke of CAA. Otherwise, there was a strategic silence. So that system works in a very interesting way. So that has been the response of the state to both the movement. Now the final point about the idea of unthinkable. What I find it problematic, at least in anti-CAA movement, was that they actually failed to understand the nature of what I call Hindutva constitutionalism. Constitution, we must remember, is something which is a text and which is, which can be interpreted in a number of different ways. What anti-CAA actually missed is that there is something called Hindutva constitutionalism. Hindutva is not there to actually, get rid of constitution at all. Rather, the idea is to interpret constitution to refashion Hindutva agenda. And that's the reason why they could not understand that what their interpretation of constitution or saving the constitution can or should become eventually the constitution-centric discourse. And this constitution-centric discourse somehow reduced the possibility of creative thinking. That's the first point, the unthinkable thing. Second is that both the movement are not raising very fundamental questions of the idea of people. Remember, since 1990s, we have been celebrating the idea of people. And we have at least 3 meanings of this idea of people in India. One is common man, that's Aam Aadmi. And this Aam Aadmi is always presented as if that this he or she is completely free from any corruption. Remember anti-corruption movement, where the figure of Aam Aadmi or the common man was presented as the ideal figure. Now the second meaning of the people which we witness these days is that of a rational voter, and that leads to majoritarianism. BJP would say that, how many people, etc. But look at the, in the first phase, 2014 to 19, many people raised this question that BJP actually got only 31% vote. So if the number game is that 69 actually opposed BJP in terms of electoral outcome. But look at since 2019, no one is saying that BJP this time only got 37% of votes. So the point I'm trying to make is that because we have started celebrating the idea of voter as a rational thinking person, and he or she would eventually cast his or her vote in a majoritarian way, we have started in a way accepting the idea of majoritarian democracy. And the final ways in which this idea of people is coming to us is as a taxpayer. We are always told that this is a taxpayer money. By the way, everyone in India is a taxpayer. But to focus entirely on the middle class imagination, this idea of taxpayer is coming again and again. So these are the limitations of both the movement. Now, the final point, Ajay, I'm really grateful that you mentioned Gandhi here. And if I go with Gandhi, I think there are three possibilities which I would like to underline. The first possibility, again, using Gandhi's theory of Satyagraha, the first possibility for me is, as I said, that Gandhi won't celebrate the idea of people. He would be equally critical to the common man or the common women, because the collection of common man and common women would constitute society. If we celebrate individual person as Aam Aadmi, taxpayer, voter, we are saying that the society is fine, perfectly all right. There is no need to question the very idea of social morality. So that's, if I go by Gandhi, I think that could be first thing. Second is, there are a number of instances in Gandhi where he would say that Satyagraha would be failed if you fail to create a public opinion. Now, what I realized that, and I have a lot of data with me at the moment, if you want, I can share that data with all of us, is that during the time of anti-CAA, there was a considerable amount of people, at least in Delhi election, and that was a clear communal divide. Hindus who actually voted also to AAP, they were saying that there's no need to do this protest, etc. So the public opinion was not there. And I would say that despite the fact that farmer protest has got some traction, certainly I agree with you, but it has failed to create public opinion in its favor. So that's lack of public opinion is something which needs some critical discussion. And finally, your central question to me was the Muslim question. I think that if I go with Gandhi, he would actually give up the idea of what we are experiencing now, that is called competitive victimhood. So everyone is victim in India, and our politics is driven by that idea of victimhood. So therefore, what Gandhi did, and that's remarkable, at least theoretically, and this is the paper you mentioned, in which there is a detailed discussion on that. Unlike any other political leader of his time, Gandhi used the term Hindu and Muslim freely. And he did not, by the way, Ambedkar was the only person who raised the question of Muslim plurality and heterogeneity and its relationship with communal politics, but not Gandhi. But Gandhi was doing a very different kind of exercise. Instead of diverting his energies entirely to think of a new term instead of Hindu and Muslim, like what Nehru did in later year, when he evoked minority and majority instead of Hindu Muslim. What Gandhi did, which is remarkable in my view, he emptied the concepts very carefully. So what he did, he did not change the concepts. Hindu and Muslim would remain the concept, but he would fill these concepts with certain action. His experiment in Noakhali and things like that would give us very different meanings of being Hindu and Muslim in India at that time. And that was the courage. That was the courage and theoretical clarity of some kind. So if we just unpack the existing categories of Hindu and Muslim, and by using Gandhi, we think of the creative ways in which Hindu and Muslim coexist in different contexts, I think we can certainly move into what I called thinking Tantra. Sorry, I took a lot of time. I'm really sorry, and thank you very much, Ajay.
Thanks, Hilal. I think both the performances in both the presentations in a way has kind of put the kind of issues that we really wanted to debate on table. So Jeff, I'll begin with a few pointed questions, and then I'll have few pointed questions for Hilal, so that in the second round you can kind of. So Jeff, your central emphasis is in terms of expanding the solidarity networks. what Martha Nussbaum calls the circle of concern in her book on political emotions, that the circle of concerns need to be, and you're very clear on this, that there has to be an identification by the white citizens of the question of race, and earlier it was a question of slavery. And this for you matters. This is what I think you also refer to as the universal normative claim within a civil sphere. I think this is a very fascinating, and I think one would go with you that that seems to be the central issue in terms of how we generate a certain kind of symbolic representation that then engulfs into this larger solidarities. But the question is, all those examples that you have given, Jeff, in terms of the Black Lives Matter, if I were to kind of transfuse them into the Indian context, I think there has been much more of organized violence against Muslims in India than you can ever think of in the context of blacks. There is sufficient information about the nature of violence against Muslims, the kind of lynchings that have happened. We have organized mob lynchings of old Muslims. It's not like young masculine men. It is like completely helpless 30 Hindu men encircling a Muslim, old Muslim, helpless, and killing him. And this is all performativity that's available in media, that is telecast on television. But my own understanding, as I see it, Jeff, is that this does not necessarily produce that kind of compassionate symbolic representation that you talk about, and Axel Honneth also thinks there is something innate in the moral story of human collectives. But I think we are looking at a situation that is exceptional. My own understanding would be there has been a kind of a qualitative decline of the Hindu majorities, as you said, the core response of even basic human response towards Muslims. And why should this be so? I mean, this was not the case even immediately post-partition. But why should this be the case under the current regime? I think it has also been happening much before the rise of this current political regime. That's my first question. I think that kind of all those issues of martyrdom, the issues of public violence, issue of victimhood, all of that is very much in the public domain with regard to Muslims, but that is not really constructing that kind of a solidarity which you think it naturally kinds of, that kind of a thing which even Axel Honneth refers to as a certain kind of a universalizability of human compassion. I mean, I don't see that. One reason for that is the question of something that's intangible, because much of your work, I actually love it because it gets into these intangibles that hard materialism does not account for. And one intangible factor is the question of anxiety of the Hindu majority. That there is an inexplicable anxiety. Even that story that I sent you yesterday, I don't know whether I shared with Hilal, the Caravan magazine. He says this guy who has been interviewed, who took part in the Delhi riots, argues that Muslims will organize and attack. You know, this is a question in waiting in the future. I mean, there is no evidence, there is no probability perhaps given the social and economic condition of Muslims, but this is a constant narrative which has perhaps been manufactured. But the more important point is that resonates with the Hindu majority. That here is a case that I think that unsettles the kind of framework you're offering, Jeff, in terms of the core group. Here is a case of the core group itself feeling vulnerable, anxious, and a sense of diffidence. I mean, one can frame it in very many different contexts. And what should be its roots? There have been multiple explanations. Ashish Nandi, and I shared the Jeff with you, and Hilal would know Nandi's own work on self, on the intimate self, on God say, explains in various ways in which this kind of a self has been built. There's a question of caste, internal caste conflict, this variation of diversity, Hindu diversity, which again makes that question of the core, I think, more complex than what is available in the context of US vis-a-vis whites. You know, that Hindu is not a compact core, and Hindutva is precisely attempting to build that core vis-a-vis Muslim as the enemy. And that's partly the reason why there is certain kind of a resonance. When I talk to my Hindu friends today, they feel that need. You know, Savarkar, who was a Hindutva philosopher, I think had an utter contempt for the diversity in Hinduism. He felt this is what made Hindus vulnerable. So that also unsettles your formulation on the idea of the core. This is not a settled core. This is a core that is still trying to find its roots. You know, therefore people keep arguing that, you know, Hindus, even in that narrative that I sent you yesterday, this young guy says that Hindus need to come together. We are not united. You know, we have to now cut across political parties and respond as Hindus. Because even this idea of the Hindu is very, very recent. You know, it's a very 20th century kind of a invented tradition. But that apart, I mean, I think these two questions to you, I think, would be my where I would find that we need to add something more to it, and which actually takes me in terms of, you know, the populism and Carl Smith's idea of this idea of the us and them, this idea of the conflict being at the core of the political, and then there is certain kind of an irreducibility of conflict, which seems to, you know, at the moment resonate much better than the kind of a moral framework that you're offering, which perhaps was true to the moment Gandhi was working. But today Gandhi is more of an empty signifier. I mean, Muslims, farmers, everybody is invoking Gandhi, but I doubt if it's really helping in terms of building those larger solidarities. So those are the few questions for you, Jeff. Hilal, I think, Hilal, you made that really fascinating point, the last point that you made about anti-CAA produced negative public opinion, and farmers movement produces a certain kind of a suspended public opinion. People did not really have a public opinion. They were neither for nor against, which takes me to this question of what is the possible explanation for this? You know, does it lie in caste? Does it lie in the popular image? Hilal, I know you keep driving this point all the time that Muslim is a heterogeneous. I think you invoke it at multiple levels, which is a very important point. But in popular consciousness, Muslim remains a homogeneous group. Second, the point that I made in my recent articles, I don't know whether if you had a chance to see in the Hindu and Wire, that Muslims are also seen not as a national community. They are seen by majority Hindus as a global community. And therefore, my central question again, which I think is a kind of takeoff from Jeff's, is that it is becoming very difficult for us to generate in terms of what Jeff would call symbolic representation in popular consciousness. Muslims can never be victims. I mean, given our history, Muslims have been rulers. I mean, the popular history of invasions. This is where I think we should request Professor Harbans Mukhia also to come in. This question of invasions keeps coming in, and secular history has a complex rendering that it is multiplicity. And all that apart, I think our central failure of popular resistance movements, and that has been my complaint also with the anti-CAA movement, is that there is no victim. Muslim can never be a victim in popular Hindu consciousness. You know, this I think is where I think it also really questions in a very fundamental way what Jeff's framework. You know, that and second, this idea that there can be a moral compassion generated with symbolic representation of martyrdom, public violence, is also something we have seen it did not work. You know, that the kind of response, even I thought that there would be a limit after a point in which majority, beyond this kind of secular left liberal kind of Hindu framework, larger Hindu society, I thought, would put down its foot somewhere and say that, you know, this violence somewhere hurt. This is what even Gandhi argued. This is what many critical theorists, including Jeff and Axel Honneth, argue, that this violence has its impact also on the majority group. You know, that Ravish Kumar in a recent public talk somewhere said that what would have happened to these young Hindu men who took part in violence when they go back to their homes? How do they kind of, this interview, I don't know whether you saw that caravan thing, that young boy says that I do repent, मुझे खराब लगता है कि मुझे ये सब करना पड़ा, लेकिन Muslims को this to teach them a lesson, we will have to do this, there is no other alternative. So I think even that question of repentance, that question of Gandhian conscience, all those things that historically we thought would somewhere plug in as something things that are not really working. Therefore, I think we'll have to really think much deeper, much deeper as to what this sense of guilt, question of anxiety, why are they playing out in this specific way? As you rightly pointed out, I think the anti-CAA movement did make great experiment in terms of bringing women and children to the foreground, which I think partly was also strategic in addressing that crisis of Hindu masculinity. That that is not about Muslim men, but it is about family, it is about culture, and they were pitching in terms of Gandhi and Ambedkar. They were also talking in terms of Dalit and Muslim unity. So they did make all the right moves, I would say. They did make all the right moves. But I would disagree with you when you say that both the movements are received in a similar way. I don't think they were similar. I understand that BJP is happy to have anti-CAA protests back on the streets. They would want to show at multiple sites that these are the specific groups which are Muslim exclusive groups, which will continue to protest, and that by default will consolidate a Hindu majority. My final question to you would be, as somebody who's observing Muslim politics and a political theorist, is that if you observe the anti-CAA movements closely, it was in the first phase when I saw in Hyderabad too, that there were large protests which included large number of Hindus, a large number of rural poor who joined these protests. But in the second and the third phase, they gradually became exclusive Muslim based kind of protests. So what explains this? I mean, this I think is something that we need to really take seriously, that there was a possibility of these protests being more composite in nature. But why is it that gradually they became only Muslim centric kind of protests, even if the rhetoric was more universal, but their social base was, I think, exclusively Muslim, and which is what I think is the source of the easy consent that this regime gets in using violence, the kind of violence which we saw in Jamia and things like that, which again, if one way to make a kind of a ready comparison, is something that they're not able to do with the farmers movement. With all those optics, force is something that the current regime is highly hesitant. You could say it's numbers, you could say many other factors might have worked, but also I think in terms of what you say, public opinion, that somewhere the regime feels it would not get that ready consent, which it thinks it will in the Muslim case. I think these are very difficult. I know these can be very awkward questions that really are discomforting for all of us, but I for sure would think that we'll have to, I think time has come to really face them upfront and then see where we can. I think there is some fundamental reframing that we require. A change in the way we imagine Muslim politics in India is also could be something that we need to interrogate as we go along. So over to you, Jeff, first, and then I'll request Hilal to come
in. Good. I mean, Ajay, you're not unsettling my theoretical framework. You're using my theoretical framework to compare recent or the Indian democratic experiment with the American one. So, I mean, my theoretical framework is a generalized framework which is used and asserts that symbolic identifications among citizens is essential to sustaining the solidarity, which is the foundation of political democracy. Whether any particular country or protest movement in that country can generate that solidarity, that is an empirical question. And that's what the theory is there for, in a way, to highlight the questions that you're asking, to generate those questions and say, look we have pictures in the media of lynchings, of massive murders by right-wing Hindu gangs of Muslims, and it doesn't generate identification with the Muslims. And that's exactly the point, that if it doesn't generate that identification, then there can't be the expansion of solidarity, and there is a tremendous compromise of democracy. So then the question becomes, as you suggest, why isn't there this identification with Muslim oppression? And you offer some possibilities. And then in that sense, empirical comparisons are interesting. I mean, you said that Hindus, first of all, it's interesting to me that the discourse here is Hindus, not Indians. So you and your colleagues talk about Hindus do this, Hindus do that. We would never say in this country, Christians do that. We'd say, but we might say white Americans do that. So, I mean, one difference is a comparison of race and religion. In a sense, religion might be a more basic source of solidarity when it's shared than race. And that may prove to be that may be the case. That may help explain why in India, Hinduism is more powerful in a sense than racial skin color. You say Muslims can never be victims in India. That is very, very important. That could be the subject of a giant book. Because in the US case, Black people, the performance of victimhood by Black people has been a very powerful source of white identification. And so why aren't Muslims, if you're right, if they can't be the source, if they can't be victims, then they can't generate identification, you're saying. Is that because of the history of invasions? Is that because Hindus have 1,000 years or 700 or 800 years that they formed against Muslims? Is that still an issue? Is that part of the popular culture, the historical culture? I'd like to see interviews with everyday Hindu citizens and see how they understand this. In the American South, even up until the 1930s, there were lynchings. So in a way, the situation you're describing, Hindu-Muslim in India today, is much like white versus Black in the American South for the first 200 years of the American democratic state. There were public lynchings where whites came and took pictures and had dinner, had picnics, while they watched Black people being hanged. In fact, there wasn't an anti-lynching law in the United States until the 1930s. So how did that change? I don't think that Schmidt has anything to say about a democratic society, because he doesn't think that solidarity across differences is possible, or let's say he doesn't think it's normatively desirable even. He promotes primordial identifications as the only possibility and undermines the possibility of universal solidarity. So I wouldn't be as pessimistic even about India, because I do want to remind all of us that India, for all of its tremendous problems, and every society has problems, there are social movements in India. There is media discussion. You are intellectuals arguing in public. You are not in jail yet. The social movements are allowed to take place. There are many countries in the world where there would be none of this. None. And you need to understand what the circumstances, the culture and structure of your society is, not just the terrible things that are producing the frustrations, but what allows there to be these movements and this discussion. That is as much part of these movements as the negative and terrible things that are going on.
Thanks, Jeff, for reminding us. And I agree with you. India, I think, is in that sense a very intriguing society. We are a very open society at one level. You know, in one of my articles, I argue that we have what I call an oscillating public sphere. You know, we oscillate between extreme polarization and rhetoric of hate, and it can be coupled up with a discourse of compassion. I think that happened in Delhi elections. I think was one good example that people did not respond in spite of the violence. Again, I mean, there could be many other reasons of how we would want to frame that, but we will bring you back, Jeff, again to suggest some more ways, as you said, that as you rightly pointed out, history is a big issue. That the question of invasions is being constructed, and Professor Mukhia will request him after this to come in. That and this seems to have suddenly it gains traction. You know, and perhaps it has been latent. One of our good social activists, Shamsul Islam, in fact, he says that it always existed at a latent level, and today you have a regime that is actively mobilizing those latent discourses that existed since the time of partition. So, and then why? I mean, this is also a question that I wanted to ask you: that why certain discourses seem to gain traction at certain moments in time in history? Why those which were latent and dormant suddenly seem to be something that seemed to be appealing to a large sections which were otherwise aware but indifferent to these things? So this is something I'll ask now Hilal to come in, and then we will go back to Professor Jeffrey Alexander.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes,
can you hear me?
Little
okay.
slow. I mean, your voice is a little weak.
Yeah, it's okay now.
Yes. Sir, Ajay sir's connection is creating some problem. Hilal sir, please go on.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Ajay, for these questions. And I follow you and your work very closely. And somehow, these questions actually offer me an opportunity to say a bit, something on the kind of theoretical framework which I am using. And probably that would answer some of the three questions which you asked. Especially the second question. The second question is about not in fact the second one, but all three, and then come one by one on the specific relationship which I make with my arguments. First is when I say Muslim politics, I understand Muslim politics at least in there are three facets of it which are connected. One facet of it is rather symbolic, which I describe as Muslim presence. So how imagination of Muslims constituted at the realm of presence in relation to other communities and the larger frame which we call India. That's Muslim presence. So the question which your question, that obviously the idea of homogenization, there is only one Muslim community and one Hindu community, is actually constituted at that level. So the Muslim presence is something which is very crucial. And whenever I say that there is a heterogeneity, I am not refuting that the presence is insignificant. So the presence question is certainly there, and I in agreement with you on that. So first is the Muslim presence, which led to creation of certain interesting discourses. I'll come to these discourses later. Now, the second facet of Muslim politics is Muslim representation. When I say representation, I am not merely talking about number games, because the moment we say Muslim representation, people would start counting how many MPs, how many MLAs, etc. But there is a deeper meaning of representation here. That is the location of Muslim elite in the power structure. So, for example, Muslim elite in BJP era, what they are actually doing, obviously BJP is not going to give them ticket to fight election, but it does not mean that they are not accommodated in the realm of the system. They are accommodated in different ways, like Waqf Board, like Minorities Commission Chairperson, Rajya Sabha. I did a work on Rajya Sabha and I realized that the pattern of inducting Muslim through Rajya Sabha is very similar if we compare BJP and other parties. So therefore, the question of representation should not be confused with Muslim presence. This is very different from presence. And finally, the third facet of Muslim politics is actual participation. Here, the question of heterogeneity is central. So whenever I say that Muslims are heterogeneous, I'm entirely focusing on that very idea of participation. So, and participation of two kinds. One is the participation in electoral politics at a constituency level, by the way, and the participation in non-electoral forms of politics. When I say non-electoral forms of politics, there are two different ways in which I'm using this. One is like anti-CAA protest, and you are absolutely right. It eventually became Muslim-centric because somehow, directly or indirectly, the representation question, the Muslim elite question also came into it. So eventually it suits Muslim elite in order to make it exclusively Muslim. But in terms, when I say non-electoral participation, I mean one more thing, that is participation of Muslims in different movement apart from identity-centric movement, like as workers, like as farmers, like in farmers movement. In Tickets rally very recently at Ghazipur, where a Muslim farmer leader, very known Muslim farmer leader, delivered a speech, and he was not treated as a Muslim. So that's a different kind of participation. What is interesting is that our public discourse is centered entirely on the first two facets of Muslim politics. That is the Muslim presence and Muslim representation. We do not take seriously the manner in which these things are happened at the bottom level of society. So that's the first two things which I want to make. The third point is about, which is a very important question. Why this idea of Hindu victimhood is coming again and again, and especially with regard to history. My first book was entirely on the question of history, so I won't go into that, but I'll make a few comments, especially with regard to the history of post-colonial India. Now, the term minority is very significant, and unlike others, I think that Hindutva is more interested in minority, not in majority, because that legitimizes their victimhood theory. And I can give you one very interesting example. And this is interesting example because in 2011, I think 10 years ago, and that the process started in 2004-5. We were discussing how to enact a law to curb communal rights, and there was a law in the parliament pending for 7 years. So when the second draft of that law was presented in Lok Sabha, RSS Andhra Pradesh unit wrote a letter to the president, and in that letter they made a very interesting comment. They said that do not look at the idea of minority and majority within the realm of the Republic of India. You have to think critically about the global scenario, especially South Asia. So we are basically a minority in South Asia. Look at, you have got Afghanistan, you have got Pakistan, you have got Bangladesh, etc. And the same argument is used to justify CAA. Remember, CAA is not about majority, it's about minority. So therefore, this idea of minority evolved. But BJP is not entirely responsible for creating that thing, because for the first time in 1991, when a law was passed by the parliament saying that there are 6, not law, but an order was passed, that 6 religious communities would be treated as national minorities. Remember that Constitution never defined what minority is, but since 1991, we have a very fixed meaning of minority at work. It means that Muslim, Sikh, Parsi, Christian, even Jain and Buddhist, these are religious minority. What is left here? Hindus. So obviously, we meaning that there was an interesting public discourse that was created in 2000 to 2010-11, that was inclusion and exclusion. So everybody was excluded, women excluded, Dalit excluded, OBC excluded, Muslim excluded, everyone excluded. That somehow provided an interesting arguments to BJP to construct a narrative of victimhood. And that's the reason when the corruption thing happened, India against corruption happened, things changed quite drastically. And the argument actually diverted into that thing. Now, the final point is about, so that is the reason why we have got a justification of that, justification of victimhood. Now, the final comment is about two things, two concepts which I often use in my work. One is Hindutva hegemony and one is Hindutva constitutionalism. This Hindu victimhood got legitimized because no political party now in a favor to raise question about it, because there is a sensitive entity called Hindu vote bank. So in order to protect Hindu vote bank, everyone would be very careful. Earlier it was with regard to Muslims. Now things changed. Very recently there was a temple that came up in Chandni Chowk, and all the parties, Congress, BJP and Aam Aadmi Party, they were in agreement that legal status should be given to this very temple. What does it mean? The consensus. The consensus is that Hindutva is the template by which we have to explain everything. That's Hindutva hegemony. What about Hindutva constitutionalism? There are three facets of Hindutva constitutionalism. One is emphasis on technical issues, not principles. Remember, there are a lot of things in preamble, so they won't talk about preamble. They would say constitution is a law book and they would assert it as a law book. Second, as I said, idea of majority, not minority. And that's the reason why there is a petition in the Supreme Court which demands that Hindus should be given minority status in the states where they are in minority. They're numerical in numbers. And finally, the final point of Hindutva constitutionalism is one nation, one constitution. And they evoked that to abrogate Article 370. So these Hindutva hegemony and Hindutva constitutionalism somehow created a framework. And that's the reason why when Mr. Modi used the phrase Andolan Jeevi, it makes sense. Because ideologically, he was in a way right, because these are fragmented movements here and there. There is no connectivity, but the state is coherent. The state is providing a very logical, systematic explanation of its existence. But on the other hand, the fragmented movements somehow fail to link each other and to raise a few larger question of political existence. So in a way, I think Mr. Modi was right. Thank you.
Ajay sir, we also have Trevor sir, but he has to go somewhere. Can we have his question once?
Trevor, go ahead.
Yes, please.
Okay,
Trevor,
thank you.
We can,
Yep.
none of us can say no to Trevor.
Okay, thank you and apologies. I actually have to take my wife to get vaccinated in about 5 or 10 minutes, so I may not even be able to stick around for the answers. But anyway, I'd like to thank you all for the debate. Very interesting. These are topics about which I know very little, so I'll try to say very little. And I really just had a few basic questions just to leave with you. One of them was actually really more for the organizers. That I didn't quite understand what's behind the idea of comparing these Indian protests with each other and then with the Black Lives Matter US protests, out of the hundreds of thousands of protests in the world. In the case of the Indian protests, obviously there are two protests against the same Modi-led government. And Hilal, I think, has usefully indicated some similarities in the rhetorical strategies of the two movements, which is interesting and important. But beyond that, I was wondering whether simply did the farmers, or are the farmers solidarizing in any way with the anti-CAA protesters and did have the anti-CAA mainly Muslim leaders express public sympathy for the farmers and so on? And if so, was this more than opportunistic? So that might be interesting. With regarding the comparison to Black Lives Matter, and I can see some loose similarity with the anti-CAA protests in that there's some kind of minority feeling injured. But I was wondering, is it really useful to compare Black Lives Matter with the farmers' protests specifically? Anyway, so that was really for the organizers. A second question, if I may. It's interesting what Hilal was saying about the protesters, in both cases rejecting political parties and politics in that sense, appealing instead to the people in these different versions that you set out, or even to embody the people somehow. I was just wondering whether they also reject civil society. So, civil society has been a major idea of the last 20, 30 years in much of the world, alongside democracy. I'm just wondering whether these various protest movements identify with civil society or stand in opposition to it, or whether civil society is just not brought into it. And then just finally, and I think this follows from some of the comments that Hilal was also making, and also Jeff about, so Jeff opened by talking about how the marginalized can often appeal to promises written into national civil codes, for example, promises of equality, freedom, and so on, in order to seek redress and inclusion. In the case of India, I think I've always found it striking that tolerance for diversity was written into the Indian National Code from the start, specifically through the constitution making process. And from my understanding, the Hindu majority from that time was fairly comfortable with tolerance for diversity precisely because they thought of their own Hinduism in those terms. And I'm wondering whether there's been any shift since then in how, and in recent years, in when you use the term Hindutva in terms of filling the category of Hindu, as Hilal put it, whether it's been a shift in the category of Hindu itself away from tolerance for diversity or not. So that's not a very well formulated question, but I hope you can see what I'm getting at.
Great, Trevor. I think these are really great questions. So you would want, do you want Hilal and Jeff to quickly kind of respond, and then maybe I can come in. Jeff, do you want to kind of quickly come in and?
Yes, I, without responding directly to anybody, because I've learned so much from what Hilal, what you, Ajay, and what my old friend Trevor has said. I just want to say that if I had any objection to the discussion so far, it's that it's too politically focused and not broadly enough culturally referenced. By that, I mean, if I'm trying to think of why is there the possibility of identification with Black suffering at times in the United States, and why has Black Lives Matter and been relatively successful? I would argue that because African American identities and traditions and performances have permeated into popular culture of the nation. So that for Black music was at the core of rock and roll and became, from the 1960s on, what white kids listened to. And so there's tremendous Black stardom, celebrity, and not just in but in the very core of the rhythms, the tones, the voices, the movements of Black culture. And that, of course, also applies to sports. Sports is at the core of popular culture. Black people are at the core of basketball in the United States, of football, of baseball. These are significant, and in terms of dressing style. So my white children, my two sons in the 1980s, dressed in Black clothes. They sang, they wrote their own rap songs. They had pictures of Black people in their rooms. So then the question is, what is the role of Muslims in terms of the dominant culture that includes, of course, or is perhaps defined by Hinduism? That's a big question. And then the civil sphere has its own popular culture with Martin Luther King and Obama, who are some of the most dominant political symbols in the history of the United States.
Thanks, Jeff. To quickly kind of fill in, that, it would be interesting for you to actually look at, Muslims did dominate cultural symbols for a very long time. The Bollywood, you are quoting Hollywood, all top, most well-paid top actors in India are all Muslims, have been at least Muslims, all been Muslims. But that does not necessarily that's where I'm saying that this idea that of extending circle of a civil sphere, somehow, maybe because of the nature of caste system, which is ladder-like, which kind of segments society, maybe that's part of the popular collective consciousness that does not naturally get into the kind of idea of civil sphere you have, which is based on a kind of solid idea. All popular symbols, in fact, food habits, much of what is considered to be great Indian cuisine, much of it is Muslim, in the South, in much of North. So, they have been, in that sense, I think the Muslim history has been at the center of what you would call popular symbolic representation. It's not that they have been at the margins, because Muslims were the rulers for a very long time. So it is but natural. But then actually the trajectory, to the kind of trajectory you project, is actually flowing in the reverse order with the Muslim question in India. That in spite of being at the center, it does not expand into, so there is some other process of mediation, some other signifiers we may have to include to what you have been saying to actually understand this question. As I say, it could be a question of anxiety. As Hilal was pointing, there are certain kind of historical specificities to this question here. But there's something more that one really needs to add, because all those signifiers that you talk about, all of them are available here in terms of popular culture, popular food habits, clothing, poetry. They're dominant in films, food, but that does not somehow somebody has to study this as to what popular consciousness, how do people kind of segmentize these two things, that there is a segmentary kind of an approach that they might accept that, but that does not necessarily translate. Also, it's individual and collective. That, if you talk to an average Hindu, they would invariably talk about, celebrate their long-term friendships with Muslims. They have absolutely no problem. There's no prejudice. What Richard Rorty talks about, prejudice as integral to recognition. Hindus don't reflect that. That's the reason I've been arguing that there is no Islamophobia in India. But when you talk about a community, then invariably you will have a lot of objections. There's lack of, there is trust deficit. So this again, individual and community do not really match up. That individual instances do not generate a sufficient experience, because again, you and Axel on its writings, you both emphasize so much on experience. But again, there is an anomaly here, that your experience does not resonate. And if you ask an average Hindu, we have had these drawing room, dialogues with my Hindu friends, school classmates, and give me one instance where Muslims have done something bad. None of them have. They will really struggle. They don't have a bad experience. They say, in fact, say Muslims are good. They're trustworthy. They're very good friends. But when it comes to community, they said, we just simply cannot trust. There has to be violence. Then the kind of language suddenly kind of shifts. I explain it in some of my public talks as the difference from the first peg of scotch to third peg. The discourse completely changes in India, in our drawing room when it comes to Muslims, from good friends to a sanction to massacre. I mean, these are, I think, various challenges we really have to social studies. That why your individual experience, your individual moral frame does not really translate in terms of a collective experience. These again operate at various levels. My own understanding has been caste-based socialization. That public morality in India is constructed in this kind of a sequential, fragmented, and this fragmentation is natural, is kind of institutionalized. So it may not work the way you have been imagining, that it kind of spreads gradually in terms of these solidarity networks. In fact, Ambedkar talks about this when it is in his difference with Marx, that he says it is not division of labor. In Indian context, it's actually division of laborers. So there is a kind of a social ghettoization has been part of popular consciousness in this part of the world. So I'll request Hilal to kind of respond to the question, and then we'll, Professor Mukhia is here. So we would, he's following, so we would really request him to fill the gap on the history part of it.
Sir, yes,
Yeah.
I also wanted to add something to Hilal sir, because CSDS also worked on election. As Ajay sir was also saying that we see as as also Trevor sir was also saying that, you know, when we see at civil societies and others, the Ram Mandir thing is really, you know, up, and donation is going. And every now and then we have news that several Muslim organizations are also donating. And also this is also UP election is just, you know, around the corner. For CAA, we have, you know, Assam and Bengal. So Hilal sir, how do you see this? Because Trevor sir also really asked that how does it, is it comparable, or how do we see in different space and time all these things happen? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Very quickly, because I also would like to listen to Professor Mukhia, so I will be very brief. I think the question which Trevor asked, I think first is that rejection of civil society. I don't think that there was a rejection of civil society. Rather, the attempt was to imitate different civil society movements which were going on. But there is, and this is something where I would like to add to what Jeff says, the culture and the political. I think that if you look at anti-CAA protest, culture was certainly there, but what was interesting in that cultural reimagination of India was that there was an unease how to respond to the formal institution called politics. And this is not merely related to the anti-CAA movement. This has been the problem with number of different civil society movement in last, I would say, 45 years. Because the movements were initially non-party, but in any way, in order to get some kind of a recognition, some kind of things getting done type of attitude, you require political parties' help. So therefore, how to relate to a political party was something which has been a very delicate question throughout social movement history in post-colonial India, especially since 1970s. And I think what anti-CAA protest also found it difficult to address. Now, coming back to the diversity question, Hindu diversity, how do Hindu look at? You know, I think we are somehow exaggerating, because there is no one Muslim or Hindu community in India. There are Muslim and Hindu communities in India. And therefore, as I said, that this framework of Muslim presence, Muslim representation, and Muslim participation is crucial. And this can also be implemented, this framework can also be employed in order to understand the politics of Hindutva at the moment. Obviously, Hindu presence is something which is defined obviously by Hindutva, and that's the reason why RSS's Mohan Bhagwat, when he delivered 3 lectures in 2018, he very categorically said that Indian diversity means Hindu diversity. And he very interestingly exclude Christian and Muslim out of it. And in his framework, it was possible to accommodate Sikhs and Jain. But he was not, this is what he called Indian diversity, by the way. So Muslims, even in this reimagination, are excluded. Muslim meaning Muslim presence. It does not mean that BJP has lost complete interest in Muslim voters at the constituency level. That's why that's why the idea of political is very crucial in order to understand these things. Just to add to what Ajay said about Muslim presence in relation to Bollywood, etc. I think the distinction between, and that's the reason why heterogeneity is important. There is 14% of 15% Muslims in India. They speak very different languages, etc. They belong to different castes. And by the way, caste is a very important issue among Muslims, caste and class. So how could we ignore these factors while thinking of the dominant public discourse which is given to us? And this is not merely the problem of BJP. If you go back in the 50s and 60s, Nehru would be saying the same thing. For example, Nehru would be celebrating his idea of diversity, in which Hindu and Muslims are units, and these units are somehow making a whole, which he addresses as India. Now, at the moment, and that's why Muslim presence is something which is always interpreted contextually. In 50s and 60s, Muslim presence was interpreted in order to justify unity in diversity in Nehruvian sense. Muslim presence is interpreted differently at the moment, where unity of Hindu and exclusion of Muslim is justified in order to create some kind of a Hindu victimhood in comparison to what they call imagined Muslim victimhood. So what we are experiencing at the moment is competitive victimhood, and therefore there is a need to address that. Final point is about the Ram Temple donation, etc. UP election. Remember that there are different survival strategies, and when we say Muslims, as I said, especially in case of UP, this is to Arjun. I think that we have to remember one thing, that every social group knows how to survive in different changing context. And therefore, the emergence and successful growth of what is called Muslim Rashtriya Sangh, which is an organization which is related to this is a Muslim wing of RSS. Why is that getting momentum? Because you need to survive. And by the way, that's the reason why we have to make a distinction. Muslims are not, in our surveys, we always find that 8 to 9% nationally Muslim vote for BJP. What does it mean? It simply means that local considerations, constituency level configurations always contribute to taking a conscious decision. By the way, our voters are equally rational and they know their interest well. So therefore, accommodate in a different changing scenario, in a different power structure is something which all do. So we should not actually trapped in the given framework of Hindu and Muslim, and look at the nuances and the complex making of the political at the local level.
Thanks, Hilal. I think that adds an important dimension of looking at heterogeneity, bringing in heterogeneity in the construction of political. So we would now request Professor Mukhia to please intervene and tell us, how would you see as a historian to this kind of a history that we have had, and the kind of popular consciousness that is being built? How do you as a historian see, how is this shift being made possible?
Well, first of all, I'm an outsider to this whole discussion, not only in terms of not being part of the panel, but also in terms of my discipline, which is history. And if that was not bad enough, it's medieval history. So I'm a kind of specialist of medieval history. But I think medieval history has become important in this context, very, very important in this context. But before I go to medieval history, let me say that after listening to this very, very interesting lecture intervention, I think I'll make 2 or 3 quick points. I think one is that we are talking of protests all the time, various kinds of protests. But I think what is happening today in the society is it is the majoritarianism itself is taking a form of protest. It's not a protest of minorities against the state or merely farmers against the state, but what the majority is doing is a kind of lodging a protest against the sorry, against the legacy of history. The history that they imbibe is a very simple kind of history. It's not the history. It's very interesting that the history that we do at a professional level among students and teachers and researchers and professors and so on and so forth, it's a very different kind of history, which constantly emphasizes, constantly looks for complexities of a phenomenon rather than simplicities of a phenomenon, and looks at uh, collision as well as cohesion, tension as well as complementarity as well as compromise in any society, any state, any ruling class, wherever, so that that's the kind of very high level sophisticated kind of history that is being practiced. And I think it's a marvelous kind of, in the last 50 odd years after independence, history as a discipline, as other disciplines, has developed. Indian historians have developed a very sophisticated kind of version of history, but the history that is that's out there in the street, outside the university campus, it's a different kind of history. It's very simple kind of history, particularly propagated by WhatsApp and TV channels and so on and so forth, and of course by spokespersons of political parties, who are, all of them are great historians. I mean, there are such great historians, led by the Prime Minister himself. Of course, his pronouncements on history are so profound. But how do you deal with a political party spokesperson coming on TV and saying Akbar was like Hitler? Now that's the kind. How do you contest this kind of? Does a professional historian contest this kind of what shall we say? Let me put it very politely. This kind of simplicity, so that the kind of history that is out there in the street, outside the university campus, is a very simple kind of history. It's a history of religious conflicts. They were the Muslim rulers. The term Muslim rule being given to us by James Mill. They were the Muslim rulers, and they were oppressing the Hindus all the time. And now, and of course, whether it was Alauddin Khalji or it is Aurangzeb or it is this, that, or the other, that was all the demolishing temples, oppressing Hindus, imposing jizya, and so on and so forth. That's all that they were doing. So the kind of history that is received at the non-popular, at the non-professional level, at the popular level, is this very simple kind of history of really. It's seen only in terms of religious identities. There is no other aspect of history that is relevant here at all. For the professional historian, many aspects of history, the economic, the cultural, the political, the organizational, and so on and so forth, the ideational, and so on and so forth, these are all considered. But at the popular level, this is simple history which makes appeal to them, and which is further simplified for appealing to them, so that the majoritarian protest that I was speaking of is against this kind of received history, which they have received not in the last 30, not merely under the BJP regime or even the this Congress regime, but for much longer. Let me say that in many ways, the history that is received at the popular level and the construction of social constructions, including agitations or consolidation, solidarities that are built on this, the history that we have received is certainly from the 18th century onwards. Prior to the 18th century, during the so-called classical medieval period, 12th century to 17th, early 18th century, in that period, the so-called Muslim period of Indian history, there were naturally battles and wars and bloodshed and so on and so forth. There was also a very clear acceptance of the difference between Hindus and Muslims. Hindus are Hindus and Muslims are Muslim. Not a very clear definition of who is a Hindu and who is a Muslim. There is often a kind of or dilution of the notion of who is a Hindu and who is a Muslim. Very often, particularly at the popular level, at the level of bhakti saints and Sufis and so on and so forth, they do sort of qualify what it is to be a Muslim or a Hindu, etc. And they knock out the notion of a pure Hindu and a pure Muslim and so on and so forth. But that's one aspect of it. But nonetheless, there is an acceptance of difference between Hindu and Muslim. There is a delightful, very, I think, 4 or 5 page discussion. It's called Hindu Turk Samvad, Hindu to Hindu Muslim conversation or discussion. Eknath, I think 14th, 15th century, 16th century. He is the author of this. A Hindu and a Muslim, a Pandit and a Maulvi, they start arguing with each other and they both make fun of each other's rituals and so on and so forth, and in the end they say, no, actually there is not much of a difference between our religion and your religion, and then they embrace each other and then they part. This is Eknath's version of Hindu Turk Samvad. Now, what is significant in this is the recognition of Hindu and Muslim as Muslim. Recognition of difference between Hindu and Muslim. And yet, this recognition of difference is not turned into hostility towards each other. So difference is not converted into hostility, adversity and hostility. That is what is not happening in medieval centuries. Let me give a very conclusive evidence of this. Throughout, from what let's say beginning of 13th century onwards to about beginning of 18th century, these 500 years or so of Muslim rule in India, there is a lot of bloodshed, as I said, in the battlefields and so on, between Muslims and Muslims, between Muslims and Hindus, and between Muslim Mughals and Sikhs and so on and so forth, Sikhs and Marathas and so on and so forth. A lot of bloodshed for capture of power and enlargement of one's zamindari and so on and so forth. But there is not a single communal riot in these 500 years. It's very remarkable, the first communal riot that takes place is in 1714 in Ahmedabad over a question of cow slaughter on the day of Holi, which communal riot is controlled within 2 days. But that's the first communal riot after 7 years after the Aurangzeb's death. Otherwise, there is no evidence whatsoever. We go by evidence naturally in history. There is no evidence of communal riot taking place at the social level. In other words, with all the political rivalry and bloodshed and so on and so forth, so social peace prevailed in medieval India. What's happening is from the 18th century, there are 5 communal riots. What's happening from the late 18th century, 19th century particularly onwards, is the intrusion of modernity, as it were, into India. A modern state system is being, not the colonial state system, but a sort of late colonial state system, which is bringing into the question, bringing in the question of social, popular mobilization. Popular mobilization as an aspect of a movement towards democracy or electoral democracy or whatever, as a step-by-step movement towards elections and electoral democracy. Popular mobilization is taking place, and that also leads to consolidation of identities at the popular level. The reason why you didn't have communal riot in the whole of medieval India was that there were communities, there were community differences, but there was no community solidarities then, because these were not part of the system, part of the working of the system, these solidarities at the popular level. Now, as these solidarities become part of the system of gradually of elections and so on and so forth, you begin to have increasing amount of communal consciousness. It's not that it was completely absent earlier, but it's increasingly getting consolidated, solidified, and that is what is bringing us into the 19th and 20th century. This kind of increasing amount of consolidation, mobilization in a democratic, modern democratic polity. It's very fascinating that this phenomenon, which we think of as pre-modern, primitive almost, this is actually a contribution of very modern polity, namely democracy and so on, electoral democracy and so on. So that's one part of it, namely that the change in the nature of community identity or communal identity or solidarity is taking place in a different, in a changing context. The context is changing, mainly political context, which also impacts on social context. That's one. Second is that the state has a very, very significant role in playing in this whole scenario. Very, very significant role. See, if in medieval India there wasn't a great deal of communal rioting, in fact, none. It was because the state was not an agency of converting people to Islam. Much against the TV channel and WhatsApp kind of
history. The fact is that state was not busy converting people to Islam. There's good deal of discussion. One can go in. It's not the occasion here for me to go into this discussion of conversion, but state is not the main agency of. It does convert people, but it's not the main agency of conversion of people. But as the state moves towards consolidation of, or politics moves towards consolidation of identities, then state also comes in. It's the point has been made again and again by all of you, namely that the difference between the fact that neither the anti-CAA movement nor the farmers movement has attached itself or has allowed any political party to attach itself as the leader. It's a sort of political movement, but non-party political movement. There is a very, very sharp distinction between them, which all of you have made that. Now, I think that's also where the problem is. You see, I see that as a problem. A political party would take up an issue or mobilize and take it to its end. Very often take it to its end. A movement
which is not leaderless. In some ways, it's also leaderless, but which has no political party, which has no, what shall I say, which goes on its own steam. And this is what the government is doing. Let it go on steam, and ultimately it will run out of steam. See, there is the fatigue factor. I think this is what happened in the CAA movement also. It's not merely that. In fact, when the anti-CAA movement took place, lots of support from society, Kerala, North India, lots of Hindus went there. So it's not as if it was entirely a Muslim movement, but gradually, partly, of course, COVID also came in, but gradually, or what the government expects now with the farmers movement, it will lose its steam, there is a fatigue factor sets in, and therefore, since there is no political party leading it, ultimately it will disperse, you see, because any movement by itself, face to face with a stubborn kind of state, it's very, very difficult. I can't see it's lasting for years together or for months together, and so on and so forth. So that's also a very big problem, namely that what does the state want? You see, medieval Indian state wasn't interested in conversion, and therefore a social peace prevailed. Modern state, a movement began about 100 years ago with the founding of the RSS. And I think RSS was very clear that while it builds a kind of social base for its Hindutva protest or Hindutva ascendancy, majoritarian ascendancy, it must wait for the capture of the state, and this has happened. This kind of consolidation, this kind of majoritarian protest has happened after the RSS and Sangh Parvar has captured the state, not before that. In the last post-independence period, somebody did mention that immediately after the partition, there were actually no communal riots, virtually no communal riots in the 1950s. The communal riots started from the 1960s onwards. So that what does the state want? What's the message that the state gives? So on one hand, you have a social base which has been prepared over the last 100 years, nearly 100 years, by the RSS, a social base built upon a certain version of history, which is taught every morning in the RSS chakas, which is a very simplified version of Hindu versus Muslim. And then the capture of state power and the state patronage to this kind of consolidation or solidification of majoritarianism. So I think in the end, it's really would be a question of which state is leading us where. It will really for any kind of what shall I say, recede or forcing this kind of majoritarian or what has been constructed as a majoritarian protest against the injustices of the legacy of history. That can be countered only if the state. Of course, it would be ideally countered if a social base is constructed for it or evolves for it, and then the state. But state's role is very, very important. Let me just conclude very quickly by saying that even now under the present regime, where the states where BJP is not in power, you don't have the same kind of majoritarian assertion, like in Punjab or in Chhattisgarh or in Rajasthan even, you don't have you're not getting that kind of assertion of majoritarianism as you are getting in UP and elsewhere. So I think the question of state as the director, as it were, of as the arbiter, as it were, or director, as it were, of what it wants the state, what it wants from society, or what it wants the society to be, is a very, very significant question. I think we should keep in mind. But I'm sorry, these are very quick reactions to your very, very enlightening, very, very interesting discussion. Please forgive me if it doesn't make much sense to a historian's intervention doesn't make sense to you.
Thank you. It's really a treat also learning so much. Sir, one thing, because the role of state, yes.
So quickly to follow up on Professor Mukhia's question, with Professor Jeff. Jeff,
Yes.
this is a
Ajay, sir, I just wanted to ask you also, that is I intervened. Shall we extend the session for some time? And sir, you have also called Navjot, Shivani also have a question. So
I think they're already tired at 2 hours.
Yes. Yes.
Maybe we'll see. We'll ask Jeff if they want to take, it's already over 2 hours. I think maybe questions we can email them and they can I think that would be better than extending the session.
Right, please, Ajay, sir.
So only the quick question that I had, Jeff, this I think in one sense, is really crucial what Professor in Mukhia's presentation it came through. One, of course, is that in Indian context, the majority itself is a kind of a resistance mode, what you would call a civil resistance. So that's one. The second is this question of popular consciousness, that much of our assumptions that we make in social theory and even in your theory would be that at the end of the day, popular consciousness, as Professor Mukhia was saying, simplifies things. It simply cannot accommodate this complexity. It simply cannot accommodate the nuances that Hilal was also referring, that whether popular consciousness, so what could be the possible explanation as to why popular consciousness comes to this kind of templates of easy binaries? Your own idea in civil sphere also, you explained this question of binary mode in which it operates. So in India, it's very, very clear that Indian history has been very nuanced. There's tremendous amount of diversity, but all of this simply does not get resonate in the popular consciousness. It's what resonates is this kind of, I think that existed even prior to rise of BJP and RSS. I think even in the unity of diversity kind of slogans, we simplify things for mass consumption. So what do we do with this aspect of popular consciousness? Jeff?
Well, popular consciousness isn't an essentialist concept, right? It has its own history. You need to study this. Maybe historians don't only study elite consciousness. I assume they also study, and sociologists do too, the development of popular consciousness in India over the last 2 centuries. I think that, what Professor Mukhia was talking about is, in a way, empire. Imperial domination, whether it's Muslims in India or any other empires in the world, did not require homogeneity. And often people have argued that the pluralistic acceptance of difference is characteristic of empires, that they didn't have genocides. For example, Professor Mukhia talked about communal riots. Others have talked about the lack of genocidal warfare in pre-modern. It's the construction of modernity, and especially ideas of statehood and universalism that want some kind of equality of identity and status that allows incorporation, and others would say that allows bureaucratization, capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. I just wonder whether, I'd like to understand this popular consciousness and whether it is it involved in a binary of Hindu-Muslim? isn't there any more complexity and counter narratives? If music is accepted as if celebrities are known, are Muslims, are they known as Muslims, or are they known simply that they are Muslims? Do they play Islamism in their celebrity performances, or is there a kind of uniform thing of Hindu? Do they play Hindus? I mean, isn't there anything called Indianness that's separated from Hinduism? Isn't there anything called Indian democracy or Indian identity that is democratic and incorporative? I mean, Hilal suggested that there is actually a great deal of that within the history of India, but I wonder in terms of popular culture.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we are all debating in.
Yeah, can I come in? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I come in? Yeah, actually, I forgot to mention that this is something which is. Let me, apologize for talking in numbers, but this is the question which we have been asking for a long time in our surveys. India belongs to whom? And this time in 2019 election, we also asked this question. Again, this is not a political question, by the way. And by the way, at that time, Mr. Modi had ruled India for over 5 years. And we asked this question, India belongs to whom? And I am going to share with you my findings. 74% Hindus said that India belongs to citizens of all religion equally, not just Hindus. 74%. And the sample size of this survey was 13,000, around 13,000. And so that's one. Second, 87% Muslims said India belonged to all, not just Hindus. And these are very recent evidences which we have collected. Now, when it comes to CAA and RC, again, we asked this question in 2020 when CAA movement was going on. And quite interestingly, at that point of time, Delhi election was around the corner. So before the election, we asked this question. And the question was, do you support or oppose CAA? And we explained what CAA means, etc. For 62% Hindus supported CAA. 62% Hindus said that there is no problem with that, while 80% Muslim fully opposed it. What does it mean? It means that the idea of plural India is still there, but the Hindutva hegemony is also taking different shape.
Right.
So this is linked to what Professor Mukhia was saying. I think he is making a very crucial point. We have to make a distinction between two configurations. In one configuration, Hindus and Muslims coexist as different, while in other configuration, Hindus and Muslims are conflicting terms. So the latter is the case which is propagated through the writing of history. So I think that these are the things which I suppose that are important for our discussion. Let me quickly say something about the thing that why this popular consciousness is becoming so, why there is an acceptance of that. Why do people think that Muslim invasion was there? And this is something what Ajay also initially remarked, that Muslim cannot be a victim, etc. So I think that we have to just get rid of this Hindu-Muslim framework and think closely about an interesting tension that evolved in 1990s. Remember that our constitution was an outcome of a historical movement. And that's the reason if we read constitution, we find that constitution is imagining a society which is just and equal. And at the same time, despite the fact that social equality is given much more emphasis in our constitution, there is also an indication that economic equality is also crucial. So that idea actually went well with the political trajectories of 50s, 60s, and even 80s.
Exactly.
But in 1991, when we adopted a different idea of India, the idea of India that is of growth, competition, and
GDP.
individual GDP, yes, absolutely, GDP, competition, a different kind of individuation, the process of individuation started. And in this sense, the popular culture also changed. So the Bollywood is an excellent example of that. Look at the films that produced in 90s later on. The idea is that you have to compete and you have to win. And then everything is compared with the West, whether it is New York or in London. So that the popular culture in which you have to get, you have to get success no matter what is your morality. And remember that we always actually accuse politicians for a wrong reason. Politicians are coming from us, they are part of our society, obviously. So we elect politicians, we have a different morality. Unfortunately, this crucial lack of, this new morality, which is competitive morality, is not taken seriously. And that's the reason why, and this is the idea of, this is something which I relate to Gandhi again and again, that this celebration of idea of people as Aam Aadmi, as rational voter, as taxpayer is problematic, and we must critically look at it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Hilal. I think that's an excellent intervention. I think that's where politics actually is in the Indian context, that the probability of shifting back to larger social solidarities, which one can refer to almost like a third democratic upsurge, which goes beyond these kind of configurations of caste-bound and religious-bound identities. But let us also not forget that we cannot turn history back to 50s and 60s. One is obviously the neoliberalism. So I have myself argued continuously that we cannot have secularism with neoliberalism. We'll have to have a welfare state for secularism. But one must also understand that once these minority, majority kind of identities have been triggered in popular consciousness, do they also recede so fast? Do they also recede once we give an alternative agenda? I think there's pretty mixed evidence that we get. I think Delhi election is one good example. Even I argue that even at the height of Ghar Wapsi, Love Jihad, you had popular Bollywood films like Bajrangi Bhaijaan, PK doing very well, which talked about that kind of a syncretic coexistence and compassion. So I think we have contextual communalism. There is still that gap between the right-wing morality and popular public ethics of everyday life, which is, I think, again witnessed in Delhi elections, where they said, Upar Modi, Niche Kejriwal. So people can think in pretty mixed normative terms. One has to only understand that once this kind of consolidation has been triggered, how much of this shift back to larger social solidarities, how do they work? What happens to those latent prejudices? Can a social agenda, for instance, something like an equal free education for all, can it successfully combat these kind of religious denominations, these kind of larger manufactured homogeneities? We don't know. I mean, I wouldn't want to be pessimistic, but that's the best bet we have as of now. A welfare state with social demands looks to be the best bet. But this majoritarian politics is not a natural substratum, as Professor Mukhia, I think, emphasized repeated. It is a state project. I think also it is a social, I would say it's also a project of the dominant caste, Hindu caste elites. It's also interested, they're invested. So one cannot forget that they would continue to invest in symbolic representations, in manufacturing these. That's where I think Jeff's work, how symbolic representation works, whether a symbolic representation of a common school education system, can it really take on this kind of ethnic democracy kind of a shift? And I think I remember talking during Delhi elections with migrants from all over Bihar and Uttar Pradesh and Delhi. They were very clear that this is not the agenda for the moment. No, CAA, as they said, is all fine. But for the moment, it was Bijli, Pani, all that. But the same voter can turn back when it comes to national elections on a Hindu-Muslim thing. So, I mean, this kind of a fungible normativity is something which I think is very complex, the way it lays out. Sometimes it seems to shrink, sometimes it can expand, sometimes there is compassion. Like in the Delhi riots, we found Hindu families extending compassion the same families were
Yes,
also
yes.
involved in violence. So this
Yes.
kind of fungibility of everyday public ethics, I think is a complex business. As you said, it partly flows from the nature of economy, partly caste consciousness, gender and sexuality play an important role. And we should, I think, take the fact that right-wing popular mobilization does understand all of this. I mean, they might look naive, they might look de-intellectualized, but I think they understand those nuances very well. You know, this example that Sudhir Kakkar gives about riots in Gujarat, he said one of the rumors that they spread was that Muslims have mixed poison in milk, morning delivery of milk. And he says this was because they wanted to hit at the primary, what Jeff would know, what Axel Honneth says, primary self-confidence, primary emotional security. You know, you take it from maternity, from mother, milk. So by saying that milk is being poisoned, the basic emotional security was being disturbed. So, I mean, the fact is that they also understand how narratives can be broken, the kind of solidarity we are building. They also know how to plant. So this, I think, is an open contest. I think this is a right note for us to conclude that we have a contest on hand, and this complexity, I think this kind of discussions help us to understand that, how through symbolic representation, re-signifying things. It's not a lost case, certainly. India, I don't think is a lost case. We are still a pretty open society, as Jeff is agreeing that we can continue to have these discussions, though there is an impending now order of universities not discussing, and Jeff, but still we are still an open society and continue to discuss. The mass protests in India, even with the recent Disha Ravi's case, I think there was a fair amount of response across civil society. So we will hope that we build on those basic bricks we will build. And with that, I think, Arjun, maybe we should conclude because it's 9:30. It's been a pretty long session.
I think
as a day ahead, I think.
Yes, sir. I think if Jeff sir and Hilal sir want to have some concluding remarks, 1-2 minutes.
On the subject, yes.
I think that, I mean, it's very late for you guys, but I would say that India is contradictory. It's what I said in the beginning, that if you still have an open democracy, you still have intense critical argument among intellectuals and in the media, you still have civil associations being legalized and people being able to form social movements. You still have a legal structure, then you still have voting, which is really what Ajay was just referring to as a kind of institutionalized mechanism for rewinding the popular culture to, for example, produce public education systems for all. I mean, in my terms, the civil sphere is a project. It's a dynamic that goes on and has no final destination, no final form. People in any given historical period always feel extremely dissatisfied with their societies. And it's the beauty of having a relatively autonomous civil sphere that allows intellectuals and everyday people to be very, very dissatisfied and to express that dissatisfaction very vocally and militantly. So we have to understand this, I think, in a broader context. I don't think that what's happening inside India is permanent. I don't think that Modi and Hindutva is a permanent hegemonic system.
No.
Why? Because India has a civil sphere that is relatively autonomous in terms of, for example, the data that Hilal reported. So I feel, pessimistic in the short run and optimistic in the long run, and optimistic about the system in a way. I mean, we've had in the United States the worst 4 years of our national history since the Civil War with Trump. A genuine demagogue, an anti-democratic, authoritarian, extremely dangerous person. Yet during Trump's reign, there was tremendous social movement, tremendous protest, et cetera, et cetera. So the civil sphere allowed a protest movement to overturn him, and I'm confident that that will eventually happen in India. Of course, that won't be the end of your story either.
Sure. Yeah, I think let's say goodbye.
Yeah, I also wish to make a concluding remark in terms of self-criticism. This self-criticism is of a different kind that we in India, especially in post-colonial India, had a very interesting history of producing imaginative ideas, creative ideas of a future society and polity. Maybe Lohia, maybe JP, there are many, many great ideas. And there is a great tradition of social movements in India. What is happening at the moment, somehow that intellectual energy is fragmented. And somehow we are unable to link that energy and to produce a concrete language of politics. That's my self-criticism. We as intellectuals have virtually failed to provide an alternative language in which politics of diversity can be played out. And I think this is our duty as intellectuals to creatively think about the ways in which that alternative language of politics can be thought about. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, Harbans, please.
No, I said let's call it a day now.
Yes, Ajay, sir, you have to add anything, or I'll just propose a formal vote of thanks.
We'll wind up, Arjun. I think it's been quite long. We have all had our say.
Yeah.
You can now formally thank us before we leave.
Right. So a very pertinent
Jeff
point.
And Hilal.
Yes, also very pertinent point.
But just one announcement, Arjun. I think just to kind of apologize to the viewers that we just couldn't accommodate questions. There are many questions, but I think I would invite, if Jeff and Hilal are okay with it, to kind of email them and they can.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I have already collected all. Yes, sir. I have already collected all the questions. I will email. And what from the history point of view, Professor Mukhia really joined and also highlighted. I'm also a China-India fellow at Ashoka University, and working also with some of the Chinese think tanks, places also. Sir was saying that majoritarian protest. So China is also it's also non-democracy, but so much of they are also united, and they are going also much ahead of China or South Asia or Asia. And they are united by century of humiliation. That is also uniting them, and they are able to do so many things. Yes, perhaps some other day we will learn. So let me just propose a vote of thanks for this very pertinent topic for deliberation today on this panel discussion.
Really, I'm thankful to Ajay sir for taking the lead and having this event, Learning by Comparing Global Protest Politics, BLM, Anti-CAA, farm protest and other protests as well. So my sincere thanks to Ajay sir for chairing this session, Professor Jeff, and also Dr. Hilal Ahmed. Trevor sir also joined. So I thank all of you, and we all look forward to learning more from you on these subjects. With that, have a good night, and thank you all the participants for being so patient and asking so many of questions. We will try to connect you over the email. Have a very nice evening, good night, and have a nice day, Professor Jeff.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilal.
Thank you. Thanks.
Have a good night.
Thanks, Professor Mukhia.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining. Okay, Arjun, see you then. We'll connect on Facebook.
Sure.
Take care.
Sure. Have a good night.